Story 1. The mile marker that wouldn't pass. Danny Cortez had been hauling freight across Interstate 40 for 17 years, and he prided himself on knowing every rest stop, every way station, and every quirk of the highway between Amarillo and Albuquerque. On the night of November 12, 2019, that familiarity became a curse that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality. He'd left the Flying J truck stop in Amarillo at 11:47 p.m., his logbook meticulously updated, his rig loaded with agricultural equipment, bound for a depot outside Santa Rosa, New Mexico. The weather was clear, the roads were empty, and Danny had made this run so many times, he could practically drive it in his sleep. The rhythmic hum of his Freightliner's engine and the glow of his dashboard instruments created a cocoon of normalcy as he pushed west into the night. Mile marker 0 slipped past his window at exactly midnight. Danny noted it reflexively, the way experienced drivers do, using these numbered posts as mental checkpoints to track progress and estimate arrival times. He calculated he'd cross into New Mexico in about 45 minutes, maybe stop for coffee at the Russell's truck stop if he needed to stretch his legs. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations between other night haulers, their voices keeping him company across the empty plains. At 12:23 a.m., Danny's headlights illuminated mile marker 0 again. He blinked, certain he'd misread it in his peripheral vision, but there it was, the reflective white numbers clear and unmistakable against the green background. Mile marker 0. He checked his odometer, which showed he'd traveled 18 miles since leaving Amarillo. He checked his GPS, which placed him exactly where he should be, moving west at a steady 65 miles per hour. Yet the mile marker insisted he hadn't moved at all. Danny keyed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker. This is Cortez hauling on I-40 westbound. Anyone else seeing weird mile markers tonight?" Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting frequencies, but heard nothing except the empty hiss of unused channels. That was odd. There were always drivers on I-40 at night, always someone to talk to during the lonely hours. He pressed on, telling himself it was a prank, some kids who'd switched the markers around as a joke. It happened sometimes, but 15 minutes later, his headlights picked out another mile marker. Number 0. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The odometer now showed 31 miles from Amarillo. The GPS continued to track his progress normally, the little blue dot crawling steadily across the screen. But the mile markers told a different story. Danny pulled over onto the shoulder, his hazard lights flashing orange in the darkness. He stepped out of the cab, his boots crunching on gravel, and walked back to examine the marker he'd just passed. It was real, solid metal, anchored in concrete, the paint weathered, but intact. Mile marker 0. He took out his phone to photograph it, but his screen showed no signal, no connection to anything. The time displayed 12:52 a.m., which matched his watch. Back in the cab, Danny decided to keep driving. What else could he do? Turn around, go back to Amarillo, report what exactly? That the mile markers were wrong. He'd sound insane. So he drove, watching his odometer climb, while the mile markers refused to change. Every 3 to 4 miles, another marker 0 would appear in his headlights, standing sentinel like a repeating nightmare. At 1:30 a.m., Danny realized he hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Not a single car, not a single truck. I-40 was never completely empty, even in the dead of night. There should be someone, somewhere. He tried the CB radio again, cycling through all 40 channels. Nothing. Not even static anymore. Just a dead silence that felt somehow worse. The landscape outside his windows had taken on a strange quality. It looked like the Texas Panhandle, with its flat plains and scattered scrub brush. But something was subtly wrong. The terrain seemed to repeat itself in ways that defied geography. He'd pass a distinctive rock formation, then see the same formation again 20 minutes later. A defunct gas station with a rusted sign appeared 3 times, identical each time, standing at the exact same angle. Danny's fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. He'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, which should have burned through at least a quarter tank, maybe more with the load he was carrying. But the needle hadn't moved. His trip odometer showed 68 miles. His GPS showed corresponding progress. Yet everything outside suggested he was traveling through the same stretch of highway, over and over, caught in some kind of loop. At 2:15 a.m., Danny saw headlights in his rearview mirror. Relief flooded through him. Another driver, another human being. Proof that he wasn't alone in whatever this was. He grabbed his CB microphone. "Breaker, breaker. This is the Freightliner westbound on 40. I'm having some kind of problem here. Can you read me?" No response. The headlights behind him were closing fast, too fast, moving at a speed that seemed impossible. The vehicle pulled alongside him, and Danny's relief curdled into something cold and wrong. It was a truck, similar to his own, but the cab was dark. No interior lights, no glow from a dashboard. He couldn't see a driver. The truck matched his speed perfectly, staying parallel to him, and Danny could see its side mirror reflecting his own cab. But in that reflection, his cab was also dark, and he couldn't see himself behind the wheel. The phantom truck stayed beside him for exactly 1 minute, then accelerated and pulled ahead, its tail lights disappearing into the darkness. 30 seconds later, Danny passed mile marker 0 again, and 30 seconds after that, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, approaching fast. The same truck. It had to be. It pulled alongside him again, dark and silent, a mirror showing him an empty cab. Danny's heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed the accelerator, his rig groaning as it struggled to speeds it wasn't designed for, trying to outrun the impossible vehicle. But it matched him effortlessly, staying parallel no matter how fast he went. The speedometer needle climbed to 80, then 90, speeds that should have torn his loaded trailer apart on any real highway. When the phantom truck pulled ahead and vanished again, Danny made a decision. He couldn't keep driving forward into this loop. At the next exit sign, he'd get off the interstate, find a different route, break free of whatever nightmare had trapped him. He watched for an exit, any exit. None came. For another hour, Danny drove without seeing a single exit ramp, though his GPS showed several passing by. The phantom truck appeared and disappeared 4 more times, each encounter exactly like the last. Mile marker 0 continued its relentless repetition. The landscape outside remained stuck in its impossible loop, and Danny's fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full, as if his engine was running on something other than diesel. At 3:47 a.m., something changed. Danny crested a small rise and saw, stretched across the highway ahead, a wall of absolute darkness. Not the darkness of night, but something deeper, a blackness that seemed to absorb his headlights without reflection. It stretched from horizon to horizon, blocking the road completely. Danny slammed on his brakes, his trailer jackknifing slightly as the rig shuddered to a halt 50 yards from the barrier. He sat in his cab, engine idling, staring at the impossible wall. His radio suddenly crackled to life. A voice, distorted and layered as if multiple people were speaking in unison, said, "Turn around, Daniel Cortez. You've gone far enough. Turn around now." Danny grabbed his microphone with shaking hands. "Who is this? What's happening? Where am I?" "You're exactly where you've always been. Mile marker E0. The beginning that never ends. Turn around." "I can't be at mile marker 0. I've been driving for hours. My GPS shows..." "Your GPS shows you what you expect to see. Turn around, Daniel. Last warning." The wall of darkness began to move, sliding forward across the pavement, advancing toward his truck. Danny threw the rig into reverse, craning his neck to see behind him, backing up frantically as the darkness pursued him. But his truck was moving forward. The darkness was getting closer, despite his reverse gear, despite his wheels turning backward. The physics made no sense. Nothing made sense. Danny shifted back into drive and spun the wheel hard, executing a desperate U-turn in the middle of the interstate. His trailer swung wide, tires screaming, and for a moment he thought the whole rig would tip. But it held. And suddenly he was facing east, back toward Amarillo, with the wall of darkness receding behind him. Mile marker 0 appeared in his headlights 30 seconds later. But this time, after he passed it, the next marker read 1, then 2, then 3. The numbers were ascending again. His CB radio erupted with normal traffic, drivers chatting about weather and road conditions. His phone signal returned, showing a flood of missed calls and texts from his dispatcher, asking why he wasn't responding. At 4:15 a.m., Danny pulled into the same Flying J truck stop he'd left at 11:47 p.m. His logbook showed he'd been driving for 4.5 hours. His odometer showed 0 additional miles. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, exactly what it had read when he'd last filled up that afternoon. His GPS history was blank, showing no record of his journey. Danny tried to explain to his dispatcher, then to his fleet manager, then to anyone who would listen. But his truck's electronic systems contradicted everything he said. The black box data showed his rig had been parked at the Flying J all night, engine off. The fuel receipts showed his last fill-up at 3:30 p.m. Nothing since. There was no evidence he'd driven anywhere at all. He quit trucking 2 days later. The company was understanding, attributed it to fatigue, offered him counseling for stress. Danny didn't take it. He knew what he'd experienced wasn't stress or hallucination. He'd been somewhere, trapped in a loop on a highway that existed between miles, a place where distance became meaningless and the road could hold you forever if it chose. Sometimes, late at night, Danny's phone still loses signal for exactly 4.5 hours. During those gaps, if he's unfortunate enough to be awake, he can hear the distant sound of a diesel engine idling and a voice on a radio that isn't there, repeating the same message. Mile marker 0, the beginning that never ends. He never drives at night anymore, and he avoids Interstate 40 completely, taking routes that add hours to any journey rather than risk finding himself back on that endless stretch of highway. Because Danny knows the loop is still there, waiting between the miles, and next time, the voice on the radio might not warn him to turn around. Story 2. The passenger who wasn't there. Marcus Webb had been a long-haul trucker for 12 years, specializing in refrigerated cargo runs along the I-95 corridor from Miami to Boston. On March 3rd, 2021, he picked up what should have been a routine load of pharmaceutical supplies in Jacksonville, Florida, bound for a distribution center in Richmond, Virginia. The manifest was standard, the weight was legal, and the delivery window was comfortable. Everything about the job was unremarkable, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. He pulled out of the warehouse facility at 6:20 p.m., the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His reefer unit hummed steadily, maintaining the cargo bay at a constant 38 degrees. Marcus settled into the familiar rhythm of the drive, his playlist cycling through classic rock stations as the miles rolled by. By 9:00 p.m., he was crossing into Georgia, making good time, thinking about stopping for dinner at a Waffle House near the Kingsland exit. That's when he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as something from outside, wafting through the cab's ventilation system. But as he continued north, the smell grew stronger. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was distinctive. Coffee, cigarette smoke, and something else. Something vaguely medicinal, like the antiseptic smell of a hospital corridor. Marcus checked his own coffee cup, but it was empty and had been for an hour. He didn't smoke, and never had. At 9:47 p.m., somewhere between the Kingsland and Brunswick exits, Marcus glanced at his passenger seat and froze. There was an indentation in the fabric, a clear depression, as if someone of substantial weight was sitting there. The seatbelt was pulled taut across the empty space, buckled and secure, though Marcus knew for certain he hadn't touched it. The smell was stronger now, concentrated in that area, and he could swear he felt a presence, a sense of occupied space, where his eyes insisted there was nothing. Marcus pulled onto the shoulder, his heart racing. He was alone in the cab. He had to be alone. He'd locked the doors at the warehouse, performed his pre-trip inspection, checked every part of his rig before leaving. No one could have gotten in. He reached out toward the passenger seat, his hand trembling slightly, and encountered resistance. Something was sitting there. His fingers pressed against what felt like fabric, rough denim or canvas, with a solid mass beneath it. Warm, body temperature. Marcus yanked his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. "Who are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the idling engine. "What do you want?" No response. The invisible presence simply sat there, the seatbelt across its chest, the seat compressed under its weight. Marcus fumbled for his phone, thinking he'd call 911, report an intruder, something, anything. But what would he say? That he had an invisible passenger? That he could feel someone who wasn't there? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Maybe he was tired. Maybe this was some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue or carbon monoxide or some strange interaction of medications he couldn't think of. He hadn't been feeling sick, hadn't taken anything stronger than aspirin in months, but the human brain was capable of strange things when pushed. Marcus decided to keep driving. He'd find a truck stop, take a real break, walk around, get his head clear. The indentation remained in the passenger seat. The seatbelt stayed buckled, and the smell lingered, but nothing else happened. No sounds, no movement, no indication that whatever was sharing his cab had any interest in him at all. 20 minutes later, his CB radio crackled to life. A voice, male, rough with age and years of smoking, said, "You're making good time, Marcus." Marcus grabbed the microphone. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" "Take the next exit. There's something you need to see." "I'm not taking orders from random voices on the CB. Identify yourself." The radio went silent. Marcus checked the channel indicator, made sure he was on 19, the standard trucker channel. He tried calling out, asking if anyone else had heard the transmission, but got only confused responses. One driver asked if he was feeling all right, said he'd been broadcasting silence for the last 30 seconds, just keying the mic without speaking. The passenger seat remained compressed, the seatbelt remained buckled across empty air, and the smell had changed, grown stronger, tinged now with something metallic and wrong, like old blood mixed with rust. At exit 29, Marcus saw the sign, "Waverley Rest Area, 1 mile." He hadn't planned to stop there, had never stopped there in all his years running this route. It was a small, poorly lit facility that most drivers avoided, the kind of place that attracted lot lizards and criminal activity, rather than legitimate truckers seeking rest. But as he approached the exit ramp, his steering wheel turned on its own. Marcus fought it, muscles straining, but the wheel rotated smoothly despite his grip, as if powered by hydraulics far stronger than his arms. His truck left the interstate and glided down the ramp, following the curve toward the rest area. He tried the brakes. The pedal went to the floor with no resistance, no effect. The truck continued at a steady 45 miles per hour, guiding itself. "Stop this!" Marcus shouted. "Let me go!" The voice on the CB answered, clearer now, no static or interference. "Can't stop, Marcus. Not until you see. Not until you understand." The rest area appeared ahead, a cracked parking lot lit by 3 flickering sodium lights. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life. Marcus's truck pulled into a parking space at the far end of the lot, backed in perfectly as if operated by an expert driver, then stopped. The engine died. The lights went out. And in the sudden darkness, Marcus heard breathing. It was coming from the passenger seat, slow and labored, the sound of damaged lungs struggling to process air. Marcus's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering from the distant street lamps. The indentation in the seat had changed shape, become less defined, as if the weight pressing it down was collapsing, losing solidity. "Look in the back," the voice said, no longer coming from the CB, but from inches away, from the passenger seat itself. "Look in the cargo bay." "The cargo is sealed," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I can't open it. It's pharmaceutical. It's locked and monitored." "Look anyway." Marcus's door opened on its own. He didn't want to move, didn't want to leave the relative safety of his cab, but his legs carried him forward regardless, as if his body was no longer under his control. He walked to the rear of his trailer, his feet moving steadily across the cracked pavement. The cargo bay doors were indeed sealed, metal bands with numbered tags that would reveal any tampering. But there was a window, a small ventilation panel that offered a view into the refrigerated space. Marcus had looked through it 1,000 times, on 1,000 different loads, always seeing the same thing. Stacked pallets wrapped in plastic, secured with straps, exactly as they'd been loaded. He looked through the window now and saw bodies. They were stacked like cordwood, wrapped in clear plastic, their faces visible and horribly wrong. Some looked fresh, eyes still open, expressions frozen in fear or pain. Others were decomposed, little more than skeletons held together by rotted tissue. There had to be 20 of them, maybe more, filling the cargo bay from floor to ceiling. And standing among them, translucent and flickering like a damaged film projection, was a man. He was maybe 60 years old, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, both stained with something dark. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath paper-thin skin, and his eyes were the cloudy white of death. He looked directly at Marcus through the window, and his mouth moved, forming words that Marcus could somehow hear, despite the insulated walls between them. "I drove this route for 30 years, the ghost said. Never knew what I was really carrying. They told me it was medical supplies, pharmaceutical shipments, cold storage items. I never checked. Why would I? The paperwork was always perfect. The weight was always right. I just drove, collected my pay, and kept my mouth shut." Marcus tried to back away, but his body wouldn't respond. He stood frozen, staring at the impossible cargo, at the translucent figure among the bodies. "Found out by accident," the dead trucker continued. "Manifest error, wrong numbers, made me suspicious enough to look. Saw what you're seeing now. Bodies, disappeared people, folks nobody would miss, all being transported to places where they'd be cut up, studied, used for things I still don't understand. I tried to report it, called the police, the FBI, tried to blow the whistle." The ghost raised his hand, pointed at Marcus with a finger that seemed to waver in and out of existence. "They killed me for it. Made it look like an accident. Ran me off the road near exit 29. Made sure the truck burned, so nothing could be recovered. Except I didn't leave. Couldn't leave, because drivers keep coming, keep hauling the same cargo, keep feeding the same system." Marcus found his voice. "This isn't real. Those are pharmaceuticals in my trailer. I saw them loaded. I have the manifest. Check again. Really look at what you're carrying. The manifest is a lie, Marcus. It's always been a lie." The ghost faded, dissolving into the cold air of the cargo bay. Marcus stumbled backward, finally released from whatever force had held him in place. He ran back to his cab, grabbed his phone, opened the shipping documents. The manifest showed pharmaceutical supplies, itemized and detailed, with barcodes and lot numbers that could be verified against databases. But when he looked at his cargo bay through the window again, the bodies were still there, stacked and wrapped, undeniably real. He called 911, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher answered, professional and calm, and Marcus tried to explain what he'd found, where he was, that he needed police immediately. The call dropped. He tried again. Same result. His phone showed full signal, full battery, but every attempt to reach emergency services failed after a few seconds. He tried calling his dispatcher, his fleet manager, his wife. Every call dropped within moments of connecting. The passenger seat in his cab was empty now. No indentation, no buckled seatbelt. The smell was gone. But sitting on the dashboard, placed precisely in front of the steering wheel, was a Polaroid photograph Marcus had never seen before. It showed a truck, his truck, engulfed in flames on the side of a highway, and standing in the background, just visible through the smoke, was the ghost he'd seen in the cargo bay, watching the fire burn. Marcus's radio crackled. "You have two choices," the dead trucker's voice said. "Drive this load to Richmond, deliver the cargo, become part of the system, or refuse, try to expose it, and end up like me, burned out by the roadside, a ghost warning drivers who can't change anything." "There has to be a third choice," Marcus said. "I can just leave. Abandon the truck, walk away. They'll find you. They found me, and I had a 30-year clean record. You think they'll let you walk away, knowing what you know? The company isn't just a trucking outfit, Marcus. It's bigger than that. Old, connected to things that don't care about laws or morality or individual lives." Marcus started his engine. It caught immediately, despite having died mysteriously minutes earlier. His trailer seals were intact, exactly as they'd been in Jacksonville. The cargo bay window showed only stacked pharmaceutical pallets, properly labeled and secured. The bodies were gone, or had never been there, or existed in some layer of reality that only revealed itself to those chosen to see. He pulled out of the rest area and drove north, back onto I-95, continuing toward Richmond. What else could he do? He'd looked for the bodies again at every rest stop, checked the cargo bay compulsively, but saw only the legitimate medical supplies his manifest described. He'd tried to report what he'd experienced, but found himself unable to form coherent explanations, his memories of the event fracturing and blurring whenever he attempted to share them. The delivery in Richmond went smoothly. The warehouse crew unloaded his trailer, checked everything against the manifest, found no discrepancies. They commented that he looked tired, suggested he take a few days off, mentioned that the company valued driver well-being and wouldn't push anyone past their limits. Marcus took their advice. He took a week off, then 2, then called in to say he was quitting. The company was understanding, processed his resignation without pushback, sent him a generous severance package and a thank you letter for his 12 years of service. They mentioned that he was always welcome back if he changed his mind. He never changed his mind. Marcus took a job with a local delivery service, short hauls within his home city. Nothing that required overnight trips or long stretches of isolated highway. He sold his personal truck, switched to a compact car, avoided I-95 entirely, even when it added hours to trips. But sometimes, late at night, he smells coffee and cigarettes and that underlying medicinal odor. Sometimes his passenger seat develops an indentation for a few minutes before returning to normal. And sometimes, when he's sitting in traffic or waiting at a stoplight, he sees trucks that match his old rig exactly, driven by men and women who look straight ahead with empty eyes, hauling cargo they choose not to examine. Marcus knows they're being tested, being shown what he was shown, being offered the same impossible choices, and he knows that most of them choose to keep driving, to pretend they saw nothing, to deliver their loads and collect their pay, and live with the weight of knowledge that can never be shared or verified or escaped. The dead trucker keeps his vigil at the Waverly rest area, appearing to those whose cargo carries secrets, offering warnings that sound like threats, and threats disguised as choices. Marcus has thought about going back, trying to help, trying to do something to break the cycle. But he remembers the photograph on his dashboard, his own truck burning, and he chooses silence. Some systems are too old, too vast, too deeply embedded to fight. Some cargo should never be examined, and some highways are traveled by those who aren't alive but can't die, forever warning drivers about choices that aren't really choices at all. Story 3. The Broadcast from Nowhere. Sarah Kimball had been driving tanker trucks for 9 years, hauling gasoline and diesel fuel across the Midwest on routes that crisscrossed Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. She'd earned a reputation for reliability, for never missing a delivery window, for maintaining perfect safety records in all weather conditions. On the night of August 17th, 2020, that reputation meant nothing when she drove into a storm that broadcast messages from somewhere outside normal reality. The weather reports had predicted severe thunderstorms moving across eastern Nebraska, the kind of late summer cells that rolled across the plains with spectacular lightning displays, but usually passed quickly. Sarah had driven through hundreds of them, knew how to navigate the reduced visibility and slick roads, understood when to slow down, and when conditions were severe enough to justify pulling over and waiting it out. She'd left the fuel depot in Omaha at 10:30 p.m., her tanker loaded with 7,000 gallons of premium, unleaded bound for a distribution point in Sioux Falls. The sky was already darkening with the approaching storm, distant lightning flickering on the horizon like artillery fire. Sarah's radio was tuned to a weather station, tracking the cell's movement, calculating whether she could outrun it or would need to shelter. By 11:15 p.m., the storm caught her. Rain hammered the windshield with such force that her wipers were almost useless even at maximum speed. Wind buffeted the tanker, making it drift in its lane despite Sarah's experience and careful corrections. Lightning strobed continuously, turning night into flickering daylight. The weather radio issued severe thunderstorm warnings, advised travelers to seek shelter immediately, warned of hail and possible tornadoes. Sarah was looking for an exit, any place she could pull off and wait out the worst of it, when her radio changed. The weather broadcast cut off mid-sentence, replaced by silence that lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then a voice began speaking, clear and unaffected by static, despite the electrical storm raging outside. It was a woman's voice, professional and measured, speaking with the cadence of a news anchor or emergency broadcaster. Attention all travelers on Highway 20 eastbound, between mile markers 385 and 390. This is an emergency broadcast. Do not, under any circumstances, pull over or stop your vehicle. Continue driving at minimum safe speed until you clear the designated area. Repeat, do not stop. The storm is not what it appears to be. Sarah grabbed her CB microphone. Breaker, breaker. This is Kimball hauling fuel eastbound on 20. Anyone else hearing this emergency broadcast? No response, except static. She tried again, cycling through channels. Nothing. Her FM radio continued the broadcast. The phenomenon began approximately 40 minutes ago. Multiple vehicles reported experiencing temporal distortions and sensory anomalies. 3 trucks and 2 passenger cars have disappeared from the highway entirely. Their GPS signals ceased transmission at various points between markers 385 and 390. Drivers who stopped to investigate have not been heard from since. Sarah checked her own GPS. She was at mile marker 386, right in the middle of the designated danger zone. Her speedometer showed 40 miles per hour, which felt dangerously fast given the conditions, but was apparently the minimum safe speed according to the broadcast. She eased her foot down slightly on the accelerator, bringing the tanker up to 45. The lightning changed. Instead of the random, chaotic strikes characteristic of natural storms, the bolts began forming patterns. They struck in sequence, one after another, creating geometric shapes across the sky. Triangles, hexagons, complex interlocking designs that looked almost intentional, almost intelligent. Sarah had driven through hundreds of storms and had never seen lightning behave like this. Current conditions include visual hallucinations, loss of time continuity, and spatial displacement, the broadcast continued. If you see vehicles pulled onto the shoulder, do not stop to offer assistance. They are not from your timeline. If you see people standing on the roadside, do not stop. They are not from your timeline. Keep moving forward. Do not look directly at the lightning patterns. Too late. Sarah had already been watching the geometric lightning displays, transfixed by their impossible regularity. And now that the broadcast had told her not to look, she couldn't seem to look away. The patterns were growing more complex, building on themselves, creating three-dimensional structures in the sky that seemed to have depth and volume, despite being made of pure electrical discharge. Her radio speakers crackled, and the broadcast voice said something that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Sarah Kimball, Tanker 447. You need to stop watching the patterns. Look at the road. Only the road. The patterns are attention traps designed to hold you in place while the displacement field stabilizes." The broadcast knew her name, knew her vehicle number, was speaking directly to her rather than issuing general warnings. Sarah forced her eyes back to the windshield, to the rain-slicked highway barely visible through the deluge. How was this possible? Who was broadcasting? How did they know her name? "We're monitoring all vehicles in the affected zone," the voice answered, though Sarah hadn't spoken her questions aloud. "Your truck's electronic systems are transmitting data. We can see your telemetry, track your position, access your vehicle identification. You're currently at mile marker 387. 2 more miles until you clear the active displacement area. Maintain speed. Do not stop." Sarah's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. This was impossible. Emergency broadcasts didn't work like this, didn't monitor individual vehicles, didn't address drivers by name. The technology required would be beyond anything available for standard trucking operations. Unless this wasn't a standard emergency broadcast. Unless the voice on her radio was coming from somewhere else, from some organization with capabilities she couldn't imagine. At mile marker 388, Sarah saw the first vehicle on the shoulder. It was a semi-truck, similar to her own, pulled onto the gravel with its hazard lights flashing. But the lights were wrong, pulsing at a frequency that didn't match standard emergency flashes. Too slow, too deliberate, almost hypnotic. Sarah felt the urge to pull over, to check on the driver, to see if anyone needed help. Her hands actually began turning the wheel before the broadcast voice cut through the compulsion. "Ignore the truck on the shoulder. It's a projection, a lure generated by the displacement field. There's nothing there. If you stop, you'll become part of the pattern, another vehicle broadcasting false distress to trap the next driver." Sarah straightened her wheel, fighting the overwhelming urge to stop. As she passed the truck, she caught a glimpse of the cab. It was empty, or appeared to be, but there was something in the driver's seat, something that flickered and shifted, present one moment and absent the next. The truck itself seemed insubstantial, as if she was viewing it through layers of gauze or water. Lightning struck the phantom truck, and it vanished completely, winking out of existence like a switched-off television. Sarah accelerated, pushing past 45, past 50, aware that speed was dangerous with her heavy load in these conditions, but more afraid of staying in the displacement zone than of losing control. Mile marker 389. the broadcast announced. "You're almost through. But Sarah, you need to know something. This storm, this phenomenon, it's not natural. It's not even entirely physical. What you're experiencing is an intersection point, a place where your reality touches something adjacent to it. The lightning patterns, the phantom vehicles, the missing drivers, they're all symptoms of two worlds bleeding together." "What do you mean, two worlds?" Sarah shouted, though she knew the radio was receive only, that the broadcast voice couldn't hear her. But it answered anyway. "The highway you're driving on exists in multiple states simultaneously. Most of the time, those states don't interact. But under certain atmospheric conditions, when the electromagnetic fields are precisely configured by storms like this one, the barriers thin. Things can cross over. People can slip between. You're currently driving through a section of Highway 20 that exists in both your world and somewhere else." At mile marker 389.5, Sarah saw people standing on the roadside. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, standing in the pouring rain without seeming to notice the water. They were dressed normally, jeans and shirts and jackets, nothing unusual except for their complete stillness. They didn't wave for help, didn't move at all, just stood watching the highway, with expressions Sarah couldn't read in the darkness and lightning flashes. As she passed them, they all turned their heads in perfect unison to watch her truck. Their faces were identical, not similar, not family resemblances, but perfectly identical, as if someone had copy-pasted the same person 6 times, and their eyes reflected the lightning with a glow that was too bright, too sustained, too obviously wrong. "Those are anchors," the broadcast explained. "People who stopped during previous manifestations of the displacement field. They've been partially integrated into the adjacent reality, can't fully exist in either world anymore. They're conscious, aware, trapped between states. They stand at the boundary, hoping someone will stop, hoping they can explain, hoping for rescue. But anyone who stops becomes an anchor too. There's no rescue, Sarah. There's only escape or assimilation." Mile marker 390 appeared in her headlights like a salvation marker. Sarah's speedometer showed 60 miles per hour, faster than was safe, faster than regulations allowed, but she couldn't make herself slow down. As she crossed that arbitrary boundary, the rain suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not tapering off, but instantly, as if she'd driven through a curtain. The lightning ceased. The geometric patterns vanished. The storm was simply gone, leaving clear sky and stars overhead. Her radio returned to the weather station, mid-sentence, as if the emergency broadcast had never interrupted it. The weather report mentioned severe storms in the area, advised caution, made no reference to displacement fields or missing vehicles, or warnings about phantom trucks on the shoulder. Sarah pulled into the next rest area, her hands still shaking, her heart racing. She got out of her cab and walked around her tanker, inspecting it compulsively, looking for damage or evidence of what she'd experienced. Everything was normal. The tanker was intact, the cargo undisturbed, the running lights functioning properly. But her odometer showed she'd traveled only 3 miles since Omaha, despite feeling like she'd been driving for over an hour. And her GPS log had a gap, a missing section between mile markers 385 and 3190, where no data had been recorded. She tried to research the incident later, searching for reports of strange storms on Highway 20, looking for news about missing vehicles, or mysterious broadcasts. She found nothing. No accidents reported on that section of highway on August 17th. No vehicles reported missing. No emergency broadcasts acknowledged by any official agency. The night she'd experienced apparently hadn't existed in any official record. But Sarah knew what she'd heard, what she'd seen, what she'd driven through. And she started noticing something after that night. Every time she drove through a severe storm, her radio would occasionally pick up fragments of that same broadcast voice, issuing warnings about different highways, different mile markers, different displacement zones. Sometimes she'd hear her own name mentioned in reference to the August 17th incident, as if her successful passage through the field had made her a case study for something. 3 months after her experience on Highway 20, Sarah was hauling a load through South Dakota when she saw something that confirmed her worst fears. At a truck stop outside Mitchell, she saw one of the people who'd been standing on the roadside in the storm. She recognized him immediately. The same face, the same clothes, the same too bright reflection in his eyes. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, perfectly still, watching the highway. Sarah approached him carefully, called out, asked if he needed help. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Up close, she could see that he was slightly translucent, not entirely solid, like a hologram or a projection. And behind him, visible only at certain angles, she could see another version of the same person, overlapping but offset, occupying the same space from a different angle. "You're not really here, are you?" Sarah whispered. "You're stuck between, just like the broadcast said." The man's eyes focused on her for just a moment. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear. But she understood the message from his expression, from the desperate look in his eyes. "Help me, please. I'm still in there, in the storm, trapped in the patterns. This is just my echo, my reflection bleeding through to your world." Sarah backed away, returned to her truck, and left without looking back. She quit long-haul trucking a month later, unable to shake the feeling that every storm was a potential trap, every stretch of isolated highway a possible displacement zone. She took a job with a local delivery company, short routes in daylight hours, avoiding storms whenever possible. But the broadcasts continue. She still hears them occasionally on her car radio when conditions are right, warning drivers about zones she'll never travel through again, listing mile markers she'll carefully avoid. And sometimes in parking lots or rest areas or at traffic lights, she sees the anchors, more and more of them. People stuck between worlds, partially transparent, watching the roads with desperate eyes, hoping someone will stop who can free them, knowing that anyone who tries will only join them in their impossible prison. The displacement fields are spreading, or perhaps they've always been there, and Sarah simply learned to see them. Either way, she knows that the highways aren't just physical infrastructure connecting cities and states. They're borders between realities, and under the right conditions, those borders become permeable. The storms aren't just weather. They're manifestations of something larger, something that treats human drivers as intrusions into spaces that belong to somewhere else. Sarah drives carefully now, watches the sky constantly, monitors weather reports obsessively, and she never ever stops when she sees vehicles on the shoulder during storms, because she knows that some distress calls come from people who aren't asking for rescue, but warning others away from their fate. Some emergency broadcasts originate from nowhere on any map, transmitted by voices that operate outside standard reality, trying to save drivers from joining the growing population of anchors who can't escape the places where worlds overlap. The woman's voice still speaks sometimes on Sarah's radio, even when she's not tuned to any particular station. Good job on August 17th, Sarah Kimball. You kept driving. You made it through. Most don't. Most stop. Most become part of the pattern. Remember, when the lightning forms shapes, when the radio speaks your name, when people stand too still by the roadside, just keep driving. Always keep driving. It's the only way to stay in your own world. Story 4. The Rest. Stop that moved. Thomas Chen hauled auto parts along I-80 between Sacramento and Salt Lake City, a route he'd driven successfully for 14 years without incident. He prided himself on knowing every facility, every way station, every good place to stop for fuel and food and rest. On January 9th, 2022, that knowledge became a liability when he discovered that familiar places don't always stay where you leave them. The run began normally enough. Thomas pulled out of the Sacramento warehouse at 4:00 a.m. His trailer loaded with engine components and electrical systems, bound for a manufacturing plant in West Valley City. The winter weather was clear, the roads were dry, and Thomas expected to make excellent time across Nevada and into Utah. His GPS showed the route he'd driven hundreds of times, every exit and landmark exactly where it should be. By 9 a.m., Thomas was crossing into Nevada, watching the landscape transition from California's mountains to Nevada's high desert. He stopped for fuel at a familiar truck stop near Reno, topped off his tanks, grabbed a breakfast sandwich, and was back on the road within 30 minutes. Everything was routine, comfortable, exactly as it should be. At 11:47 a.m., Thomas passed the Silver Creek rest area. He'd stopped at Silver Creek countless times over the years. It was a modest facility on the Nevada side of I-80, nothing fancy but clean and well-maintained, with adequate parking for several trucks and a small building with restrooms and vending machines. Thomas didn't stop this time because he'd fueled up in Reno and didn't need a break yet. But he noted its location reflexively. Mile marker 212. Same as always. 50 miles later, Thomas saw the Silver Creek rest area sign again. He blinked, certain he'd misread it. But no, there it was, the familiar brown sign indicating rest area services ahead, specifically naming Silver Creek. His GPS showed he was at mile marker 262, exactly 50 miles past where Silver Creek should be. Yet the sign insisted the rest area was 1 mile ahead. Thomas took the exit, more confused than concerned. Maybe there were 2 Silver Creek rest areas, though he'd never heard of such a thing. Maybe he'd been wrong about the location all these years, though that seemed unlikely given how often he'd stopped there. The access road curved away from the highway, descending slightly into a shallow valley. And there it was. The Silver Creek rest area, identical to the one he'd passed 50 miles back. Same layout, same building design, same parking configuration. Thomas pulled into a truck space and turned off his engine, then sat for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He took out his phone and checked mapping applications. Every app showed only one Silver Creek rest area, located at mile marker 212. There was no facility listed at marker 262. Yet here he was, undeniably parked at a rest area called Silver Creek, that his phone insisted didn't exist. Thomas got out and walked toward the building. The parking lot held 3 other semi-trucks and 2 passenger cars, all with their engines off, no sign of their drivers. The building door was propped open, and Thomas could hear the hum of vending machines from inside. Everything looked normal, operational, well-maintained. Inside, Thomas found the restrooms clean and recently serviced. The vending machines were fully stocked, their contents current and not expired. A small seating area held plastic chairs and tables, exactly like the Silver Creek he knew. But something was subtly wrong. The paint was the same color but seemed newer, fresher. The floor tiles were identical, but showed no wear patterns. It was as if someone had built a perfect replica of Silver Creek, but forgotten to add the accumulated aging of years of use. Thomas bought a soda from a vending machine, more to test if it worked than because he was thirsty. The machine accepted his payment, delivered the drink. The can was cold, the soda tasted normal. He checked the manufacturing date on the bottom of the can. 2 weeks ago. Everything was current, real, functioning. Back outside, Thomas approached one of the other trucks. The driver's door was unlocked, and when he peered inside, he saw a jacket draped over the passenger seat, a coffee cup in the holder, a phone plugged into the charger. Signs of recent occupation. But no driver. Thomas called out, his voice echoing across the empty parking lot. No response. He checked the other trucks. All showed similar signs of recent use, all had their doors unlocked, and none had drivers anywhere in sight. The passenger cars were the same, personal effects visible inside, keys in ignitions in one case, but no people. It was as if everyone had simply vanished mid-stop. Thomas returned to his own truck and tried his CB radio. Breaker, breaker. This is Chen at the Silver Creek rest area. Anybody hearing me? Static. He tried his cell phone, intending to call his dispatcher, but found he had no signal despite having shown full bars just minutes earlier. He decided to leave. Whatever was happening here, Thomas wanted no part of it. He started his engine, backed out of the parking space, and drove toward the exit road that would return him to I-80. The road curved upward, ascending back to highway level, and Thomas followed it carefully. Except it didn't lead to I-80. Instead, the road curved back on itself and deposited Thomas right back at the Silver Creek rest area parking lot. He was facing his own parking space, could see the faint exhaust smoke still hanging in the air from where he'd started his engine moments ago. Thomas tried again, following the exit road more carefully, watching for any branch or alternate path he might have missed. But there was only one road, and it led inexorably back to the parking lot. After his third attempt, Thomas stopped and accepted that the rest area wasn't going to let him leave the normal way. He got out and examined the surrounding area on foot. The rest area sat in a shallow depression, surrounded by low hills covered in scrub brush and sage. Beyond the parking lot and building, a chain-link fence marked the facility's boundary. Thomas walked along the fence, looking for a gate or break, some way to escape on foot if his truck couldn't. The fence extended in both directions further than he could see, following the contours of the hills, apparently enclosing the entire valley. Thomas followed it for what felt like an hour, his sense of distance becoming confused as landmarks failed to change the way they should. He'd swear he was walking in a straight line, but somehow he kept ending up back at the rest area building, approaching it from different angles, but always arriving at the same place. The sun was setting when Thomas gave up trying to leave. He returned to his truck, climbed into the sleeper berth, and tried to make sense of his situation. He had food, water, a full tank of fuel. His phone still showed no signal. His GPS had gone blank, showing his position as an undefined point, not on any map. The time display showed 6:23 p.m., which seemed approximately correct based on the sunset. Thomas tried to sleep, but found it impossible. The rest area was too quiet, too still. No wind, no animal sounds, no distant highway traffic. Just absolute silence, broken only by his own breathing and heartbeat. Around midnight, he saw lights through his sleeper berth window. Another truck was pulling into the rest area. Thomas watched as it parked 3 spaces away, its engine shutting off, its lights going dark. He waited for the driver to emerge, ready to call out, to share his situation with someone else. But no one got out. The truck simply sat there, silent and dark. Thomas climbed down from his cab and approached the new arrival. He knocked on the driver's door, peered through the window. The cab was empty, had been empty when it arrived. The truck had driven itself into the parking lot, parked itself, and shut itself down without any human guidance. Over the next hour, 2 more trucks arrived, following the same pattern. They drove in autonomously, parked in spaces, and sat empty. Then a passenger car arrived, then another truck. All self-driving, all empty, all parking themselves in an orderly fashion. Thomas returned to his cab and tried the radio again. This time, he got a response. A voice, crackling with slight static, said, "Silver Creek Rest Area serves as a collection point. Please remain in your vehicle until processing begins." "Collection point for what?" Thomas demanded. "Processing what? Who is this?" "The rest area has been designated as a temporary holding facility. Your vehicle was selected based on route optimization and cargo compatibility criteria. Please wait for further instructions." "I'm not waiting for anything. I'm leaving. Open the exit road, or I'll drive through that fence." "The fence is permeable only from outside. You cannot leave until released. This is not negotiable." Thomas started his engine, determined to call the bluff. He drove toward the fence at the far end of the parking lot, intending to crash through if necessary. But as his bumper touched the chain link, the metal became somehow solid, immovable, as if he'd driven into a concrete wall. The fence didn't bend or break or even rattle. It simply stopped his truck completely, absorbing all momentum without visible strain. The radio voice spoke again. "You are cargo, Thomas Chen. Your truck, your trailer, your load, and you yourself were collected based on specific requirements. The rest area exists in a space adjacent to your highway system, accessible only through transitional points that open at designated intervals. You passed through such a transition at mile marker 262. This is insane. You can't just kidnap drivers and their cargo. People will look for me. The company's records show you stopped at Silver Creek Rest Area at mile marker 212 at 11:47 a.m. and departed at 12:15 p.m. Your GPS logs confirm this. There is no anomaly, no missing time, no reason for concern. From your world's perspective, you completed your stop and continued driving." Thomas checked his GPS. It showed exactly what the voice described: a recorded stop at the real Silver Creek, a departure, continued travel along I-80 toward Utah. But he was here, trapped in this impossible place, with a GPS telling lies about his location. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow. "Processing begins at dawn. Your cargo will be inventoried and transferred. Your vehicle will be documented and archived. You will be interviewed regarding your knowledge of temporal infrastructure and dimensional navigation capabilities. Afterward, you'll be returned to your timeline with no memory of this collection. And if I refuse to cooperate, refusal is not supported. Your consciousness will be preserved regardless of cooperation level. Memory removal is not dependent on compliance. Thomas spent the rest of the night watching more vehicles arrive. By dawn, the parking lot held 23 trucks and 15 passenger cars, all sitting empty except for his own. When the sun rose, things that weren't quite human emerged from the building. They moved like people, were shaped like people, but something about their movements was wrong. Too smooth, too precisely coordinated, as if operated by software rather than nervous systems. They wore coveralls with no identifying marks, and their faces, when Thomas got a good look, were slightly off. Symmetrical to a degree, human faces never achieved. Features too perfectly proportioned, eyes that didn't blink or focus quite right. They began opening trucks, checking cargo, making notes on tablets that showed symbols Thomas didn't recognize. When they reached his truck, they gestured for him to exit the cab. Thomas considered refusing, but what would be the point? He couldn't escape, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything except comply and hope. The voice had been honest about returning him afterward. The not-quite-human workers inventoried his auto parts with meticulous precision, scanning each component, recording data, occasionally removing certain pieces for closer examination. They worked in complete silence, didn't respond when Thomas tried to speak to them, showed no acknowledgement of his presence beyond directing him where to stand. After his cargo was processed, they directed him into the building. Inside, the familiar rest area layout had been replaced by something else. Clinical white rooms with equipment that looked more medical than administrative. They sat him in a chair and attached sensors to his temples, his wrists, his chest. A voice, possibly the same one from the radio, asked him questions. How did you first become aware of rest areas? What? I don't. They're public facilities. Everyone knows about them. Describe your earliest memory of using a rest area. Thomas tried to think back, found his memories strangely vague. He'd stopped at rest areas for years, decades. But when he tried to remember specific early instances, his mind kept sliding away from concrete details. I can't. I'm not sure. When I started trucking, I guess. They were just there. Have you ever noticed rest areas that appear in different locations than expected? No, not until today. Have you ever experienced temporal discontinuities while using rest area facilities? What does that even mean? Missing time, confused memories, arrival and departure times that don't match experience duration. Thomas wanted to say no, but a strange certainty stopped him. There had been times, hadn't there? Stops that felt longer or shorter than the clock suggested. Moments of confusion about how long he'd been parked. He'd always attributed it to fatigue or distraction, but now those memories took on new significance. The interview continued for what felt like hours, covering topics Thomas barely understood. Questions about his perception of space, about his navigation instincts, about whether he'd ever felt guided to particular stops or routes. Many questions he couldn't answer coherently. Some questions awakened vague memories he wasn't sure were real. Finally, they removed the sensors and directed him back outside. His truck sat where he'd left it, cargo reloaded, everything appearing normal. The not-quite-human workers had vanished. The other vehicles were gone. Only his truck remained in the parking lot. The radio crackled. "Thank you for your cooperation, Thomas Chen. You may depart. The exit road is now accessible. You will arrive at your next scheduled stop with no temporal discrepancy. This experience will be removed from your active memory within 6 hours. Residual fragments may persist as dreams or vague impressions." "Wait," Thomas said, but the radio was silent. He started his engine and drove toward the exit road. This time, it led smoothly back to I-80. Thomas merged onto the highway and checked his GPS. It showed him at mile marker 263, exactly where he'd be if he'd never stopped at all. The time was 11:49 a.m., only 2 minutes after he'd originally seen the rest area sign. The entire experience, all the hours he'd spent trapped, had occurred within a 2-minute window according to his timeline. Thomas drove to Utah and completed his delivery. He tried to hold on to the memories, to resist the promised removal, but found them fading despite his efforts. By evening, he could remember being at a rest area, remember feeling confused, but the specific details dissolved like dreams on waking. Within 6 hours, all that remained was a vague unease about the Silver Creek rest area and a new habit of avoiding it entirely. He still drives I-80, still hauls cargo between California and Utah. But Thomas has developed an unconscious habit of accelerating past mile marker 262, of never stopping at facilities that appear in unexpected locations. And sometimes, late at night, he dreams about white rooms and questions he can't quite remember, and workers whose faces are too perfectly symmetrical to be human. Other drivers have reported similar stories, if you know how to listen. Rest areas that move, stops that take no time or too much time, parking lots full of empty vehicles, workers who don't look quite right. But the stories are always fragmentary, half-remembered, more impression than fact. Because the collections are designed that way, designed to leave no clear evidence, only enough residual memory to make drivers unconsciously avoid the transitional points. The highway system is more than it appears. The rest areas serve purposes beyond their stated function. And somewhere in the spaces between mile markers, in the valleys that exist adjacent to our roads, the collections continue. Vehicles are processed, cargo is inventoried, drivers are interviewed and released with their memories carefully edited. And the rest areas move, appearing wherever and whenever they're needed, serving infrastructure that humans use but don't control. Thomas suspects all of this, in the way you suspect dreams that feel too significant to be random. But he can't prove anything, can't remember enough to make coherent reports. So he drives and avoids certain exits and wonders if the hours he remembers are the real ones, or if whole sections of his life have been quietly removed, leaving gaps he's learned not to notice. Story 5. The Cargo That Watched. Jennifer Marks specialized in high-value cargo transport, carrying electronics and computer equipment for tech companies along the West Coast. Security was paramount in her line of work, and she'd installed every possible anti-theft system in her truck, from GPS tracking to real-time video monitoring of her cargo bay. On October 28, 2019, those cameras recorded something they were never designed to see, and Jennifer learned that some cargo does more than watch passively. The pickup was at a distribution facility in Portland, Oregon, a routine collection of server equipment, bound for a data center in San Jose, California. Jennifer arrived at the facility at 2:10 p.m., presented her credentials, and watched as workers loaded 38 identical shipping crates into her refrigerated trailer. The manifest described the contents as proprietary computing hardware, with an insured value that made Jennifer's hands sweat when she signed for it. Standard protocol for high-value loads required Jennifer to verify the cargo at both loading and unloading, using her truck's internal cameras to document that nothing had been tampered with during transport. She had 6 cameras mounted in the cargo bay, covering every angle, recording continuously to encrypted drives. She'd transported millions of dollars worth of equipment over the years, and nothing had ever gone wrong. She departed Portland at 3:30 p.m., planning to drive straight through with only mandatory rest breaks, arriving in San Jose by morning. The weather was overcast but clear, the traffic was light, and Jennifer settled into the focused calm that came with high-value hauls. She checked her cargo camera feeds every 20 minutes, standard practice, verifying that the crates remained secure and undisturbed. At 6:45 p.m., somewhere south of Eugene, Jennifer checked her cameras and froze. One of the crates was open. Not damaged, not broken into, but open. Its lid lifted and pushed aside to reveal packing material. Jennifer stared at the monitor, confusion warring with growing alarm. The crate had been sealed at the warehouse, security tape applied, all protocols followed. There was no way it could have opened on its own. She pulled onto the shoulder and reviewed the camera recordings, rewinding to find when the opening occurred. The timestamp showed 6:38 p.m. 7 minutes ago. Jennifer watched the footage, expecting to see the crate jolted open by rough road conditions or equipment shift. Instead, she saw the lid simply rise, pushed upward from the inside, moving smoothly despite there being no visible mechanism or explanation for the motion. Something was inside the crate, something that was apparently alive and mobile. Jennifer grabbed a flashlight and her phone, then stepped out of the cab. Company policy strictly prohibited opening the trailer during transport without authorization, but this clearly qualified as an emergency situation. She opened the cargo bay doors, the refrigerated air spilling out in a cold cloud, and climbed inside. The opened crate sat in the middle of the trailer, surrounded by its sealed companions. Jennifer approached it carefully, shining her flashlight inside. The packing material had been disturbed, pushed aside, but she couldn't see what the crate actually contained. She reached in cautiously and moved the foam aside. The crate was empty, completely empty. Whatever had pushed the lid open was gone. Jennifer searched the cargo bay methodically, checking between and behind the other crates, looking for any sign of what had escaped. She found nothing. 37 sealed crates and 1 empty one. The cargo bay doors had been closed until she'd opened them 30 seconds ago, so nothing could have gotten out. Yet nothing was in the crate, and nothing was hiding anywhere she could find. She closed the trailer and returned to her cab, deeply unsettled. She tried calling her dispatcher to report the situation, but her phone showed no signal, despite being in an area with normally good coverage. She considered driving to the nearest town and finding a landline, but that would mean leaving the rest of her cargo unattended, and the insurance requirements prohibited that absolutely. Jennifer decided to continue driving and report the incident at her next scheduled stop. a rest area about 40 miles ahead. She checked the cargo cameras continuously as she drove, watching for any further disturbance. The empty crate sat open and undisturbed. The other crates remained sealed. Nothing moved in the cargo bay. At 7:15 p.m., Jennifer's headlights picked out a figure standing on the roadside. It was a man, or man-shaped at least, wearing what looked like a business suit. He stood perfectly motionless on the shoulder, facing the highway, not waving for help or showing any signs of distress. Just standing, watching. Jennifer passed him without slowing, but as she did, the figure turned its head to track her truck. The movement too smooth, too fast, mechanically precise. Jennifer checked her mirrors and saw the figure still standing there, now facing away down the highway in the direction she'd gone. Still perfectly motionless, except for that one unnatural head turn. Her cargo cameras flickered. For just a moment, all 6 feeds cut to static, then returned to normal. Jennifer's heart hammered. Nothing in her cameras had ever malfunctioned before. The system was redundant, professionally installed, designed to prevent exactly this kind of failure. When the feeds returned, there were only 36 sealed crates visible in the cargo bay. Jennifer slammed on the brakes, her trailer shuddering as the air brakes engaged. She pulled onto the shoulder, grabbed her flashlight, and threw open the cargo bay doors. 36 crates. She counted them 3 times. 36. There should be 37 sealed crates and 1 empty one. 38 total. Now there were only 36, and the empty crate was gone. She reviewed the camera recordings, watching the moment when the feeds had cut to static. When the image returned, it showed only 36 crates, as if 2 had simply ceased to exist. There was no transition, no movement, just a moment of static, and then fewer crates. Jennifer scrambled to check her manifest, to verify the original count. 38 crates. She'd watched them being loaded. She'd verified the count at the warehouse. But now she had only 36, and the math made no sense unless 2 crates had somehow vanished during a moment of camera malfunction. She got back in her cab, her hands shaking. This was beyond unusual cargo issues, beyond equipment malfunction. This was impossible. Crates didn't vanish, empty containers didn't disappear, and cameras didn't malfunction in ways that coincided exactly with cargo anomalies. Jennifer tried her phone again. Still no signal. She tried the CB radio. Static on all channels. She was completely cut off, alone on a highway that suddenly felt hostile and wrong. At 7:47 p.m., Jennifer saw 2 figures standing on the roadside. They were identical to the first, same suits, same stance, same unnatural stillness. They stood about 20 yards apart, both facing the highway, both tracking her truck with those 2 smooth head movements as she passed. Jennifer didn't stop, didn't slow down, kept driving with her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Her cargo cameras flickered again. Static. Then 35 crates. 3 more figures appeared over the next hour, each identical to the others, each standing alone by the roadside, each triggering a camera malfunction and the loss of another crate. By 8:45 p.m., Jennifer's cargo bay held only 33 crates, and she'd passed 6 mysterious figures. She finally reached the rest area she'd been aiming for, pulled into a parking space, and ran to the building to find someone, anyone, to help her understand what was happening. But the rest area was empty. No other vehicles, no attendants, no signs of human presence. The building was locked, the lights were off, and Jennifer's pounding on the doors echoed uselessly. When she returned to her truck, 7 figures stood in a semicircle around it. They were all identical, all wearing the same suit, all standing with the same perfect posture. Their faces, when Jennifer got a good look in her headlights, were smooth and featureless. Not masked, not covered, but simply blank, as if they had no facial features at all. Yet somehow she knew they were looking at her, watching her, waiting for something. Jennifer climbed into her cab and locked the doors, aware of how useless that was against whatever these things were. She checked her cargo cameras. 29 crates now. 4 had vanished while she'd been at the rest area building. She watched the current feed, and as she did, another crate simply faded from view, its image becoming transparent, and then gone, leaving an empty space where it had been. Her radio crackled to life. A voice, distorted and strange, said, "Jennifer Marks, you are transporting stolen property. The manifest describes computing hardware. That is incorrect. The crates contain something else, something taken without permission, something that must be recovered." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jennifer said. "I'm just the driver. I transport what I'm told to transport." The contents of the crates are biological in nature. They are components of distributed intelligence systems. What you call proprietary computing hardware is actually neural tissue, grown and harvested, distributed across multiple containers to form a network. The company that hired you acquired this tissue illegally. We are reclaiming it. Jennifer's stomach turned. Biological material, neural tissue. She'd been told it was servers, computer equipment. If this voice was telling the truth, she'd been transporting something very different, something alive, or at least derived from living things. "Who are you?" Jennifer asked. "What are those figures outside my truck?" "We are recovery specialists. The figures are projection interfaces, allowing us to interact with your physical space. Each crate that opens releases the neural component inside, which we retrieve and transport back to its origin. You were not intended to witness this process. The camera malfunctions were supposed to erase your knowledge of the retrieval. Then why am I still aware? Why can I remember? You resisted the memory suppression. Your awareness remained active during attempted erasure. This is unusual. Most humans accept the edited narrative without question. Your consciousness is more resilient than expected." The figures outside began moving, approaching the trailer, their featureless faces somehow conveying purpose. Jennifer watched on her cameras as they simply walked through the cargo bay doors, passing through the metal as if it didn't exist. They moved between the remaining crates, touching them, and wherever they touched, the crates faded and vanished. Within minutes, Jennifer's cargo bay was empty. 29 crates had simply ceased to exist, their contents retrieved by entities that could walk through solid matter and erase things from reality. Jennifer sat in her cab, watching her camera show nothing but empty trailer space. "What do I do now?" she asked the radio. "How do I explain this to my company? The cargo is gone. I have no evidence, no explanation they'll believe." "You will remember arriving at the San Jose facility and delivering 38 crates of server equipment as contracted. Your cargo cameras will show a complete, undisturbed journey. The manifest will be signed by receiving personnel. There will be no discrepancy, no missing cargo, no reason for concern. You're going to alter my memory again. We will restore the expected narrative. You will not remember this conversation, this retrieval, or the figures you saw. Your experience will match the official records. And if I refuse? If I fight it like I did before? Silence from the radio. Then, resistance is not recommended. Humans who retain memories of our operations often develop psychological difficulties. The knowledge of what truly moves through your supply chains, what is disguised as mundane cargo, what exists in spaces adjacent to your world. This knowledge is not compatible with normal human function. Let us restore your expected narrative. It will be better for you. Jennifer wanted to refuse, to insist on keeping her memories, on understanding what she'd witnessed. But she also knew the voice was probably right. How could she function knowing that cargo wasn't always cargo? That some shipments were alive or semi-alive? That creatures existed that could walk through walls and edit reality? Will this happen again? Jennifer asked. Will I transport more of these things? Possibly. The company you work for has contracts with entities that utilize neural distribution networks. But you won't know. You'll see server equipment and computing hardware, and you'll deliver it successfully, and you'll be paid for professional service. The retrieval you witnessed was an exception, an emergency recovery of stolen material. Normal transports proceed without incident. Jennifer's cargo cameras flickered. When they cleared, the trailer showed 38 sealed crates, properly secured, exactly as they'd appeared when loaded in Portland. Her trip computer showed 8:52 p.m., and her GPS indicated she was at a rest area south of Eugene, right on schedule for her normal breaks. Her phone had signal. Her radio received normal CB traffic. The parking lot held other trucks and cars with visible drivers. The building was lit and open. Everything was normal, ordinary, exactly as a rest area should be. Jennifer got out and walked to her trailer, opened the doors. 38 crates, all sealed, all secure. She checked several at random, cutting through security tape to verify contents. Each crate held what appeared to be server equipment, circuit boards and processors and cooling systems, all properly packed and undamaged. She closed the trailer, completed her rest break, and continued driving to San Jose. She delivered the cargo the next morning without incident. The receiving facility signed her manifest, confirmed the count, reported no damage or tampering. Jennifer collected her payment and moved on to her next job. But something wasn't right. Jennifer couldn't remember specific details of the Portland to San Jose run, even though she'd completed it just hours earlier. She had vague impressions of rest stops and highway miles. But when she tried to recall specific moments, specific decisions she'd made, her mind slipped away from the memories, as if they were coated in something slippery. She checked her cargo camera recordings and found them normal, showing an uneventful journey with stable cargo from start to finish. But she also found gaps, moments where the timestamp jumped forward by several minutes, with no corresponding footage. The missing segments totaled about 43 minutes, scattered across the journey. Jennifer tried to explain the missing footage to her company's technical support. They remotely accessed her system, ran diagnostics, found no errors. They suggested she'd accidentally deleted segments, or that the storage had glitched. They offered to replace the entire camera system if she was concerned, but insisted the current recording showed no evidence of malfunction. Over the following weeks, Jennifer developed a habit of checking her cargo compulsively, verifying contents at every stop. trying to catch whatever she suspected was happening, but couldn't quite remember. She found nothing unusual. Every load was exactly what the manifest described. Every delivery was successful. Yet the sense that something was wrong persisted. She started having dreams. Featureless figures in suits, standing on highways, watching her truck pass. Crates that opened from the inside. Voices on radios explaining things about neural tissue and biological cargo and reality that could be edited. The dreams felt more like memories, but when she tried to examine them closely, they fragmented and dissolved. Jennifer quit high-value cargo transport after 6 months. She switched to hauling non-refrigerated freight, avoiding electronics and computing equipment, choosing loads that were simple and verifiable. But sometimes, late at night, she still sees figures standing on roadsides, and sometimes her cargo cameras still show brief moments of static, and sometimes she arrives at destinations with no clear memory of the journey. She knows something happened during that Portland to San Jose run. She knows her memories were altered, but she can't prove it, can't recover what was taken, can't explain to anyone what she suspects. So she drives different routes now, carries different cargo, and tries not to wonder how many other drivers are transporting biological materials they mistake for electronics. How many shipments contain things that are alive and aware? How many trucks on the highway carry cargo that watches the drivers who haul it? The supply chain is vast and complex, and humans understand only a fraction of what moves through it. Jennifer knows this now, in a way that goes beyond rational knowledge, that lives in her dreams and her gaps of missing memory. And she's learned that some jobs are safer when you don't look too closely at what you're carrying, when you don't check your cameras too carefully, when you accept that some missing minutes are better left unrecovered. Story 6. The Highway That Turned. Robert Vasquez had been driving overnight routes across Texas for 21 years, specializing in the long, lonely stretches between Houston and El Paso, where the landscape barely changed for hundreds of miles. On June 14, 2018, he discovered that familiar roads can turn into something else entirely when the conditions are exactly wrong. He'd left Houston at 11:00 p.m., his rig loaded with industrial piping, bound for a construction project in El Paso. The route was utterly routine. I-10 west, straight across Texas, a journey he'd made at least 300 times. The weather was clear, the traffic was light, and Robert expected to arrive by mid-morning with no complications. By 1:30 a.m., Robert was passing through the empty stretch between San Antonio and Junction, the darkest part of the drive, where civilization retreated, and the landscape became an endless expanse of scrub brush and stars. His headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, the road stretching ahead in a perfectly straight line toward the western horizon. At 2:17 a.m., I-10 turned left. Robert blinked, confused. The highway had always run straight through this section, a feature he'd counted on for years to make time without navigation challenges. But now, the road was curving, a gentle leftward bend that continued for several hundred yards before straightening again. Robert checked his GPS, which showed I-10 continuing west in its familiar straight line, no curves indicated. Yet the road was definitely curved. Robert had just driven through the bend, felt his truck follow the arc. His hands had turned the wheel. His sense of direction had adjusted. The curve was real, had existed physically, despite his GPS insisting otherwise. Maybe he'd been mistaken about this section being straight. 21 years of night driving created a lot of memories that could blur together. Maybe there had always been a curve here, and he'd simply forgotten it in the automatic routines of familiar routes. 10 minutes later, I-10 turned right. This time, Robert was paying attention. The highway had been running straight, exactly as his GPS indicated. Then, without any transitional signage or gradual curve leading into it, the road simply bent right. A 90-degree turn that lasted about a quarter mile, before returning to its westward heading. Robert's GPS showed no such turn, no deviation from the straight path it insisted he was following. Robert pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. He got out of his cab and looked back the way he'd come. The highway behind him ran straight to the eastern horizon. No visible turn, no curve or bend breaking the line. He looked ahead. The highway ran straight to the western horizon, identical in appearance. Yet he'd just driven through a 90-degree turn, had felt his trailer sway slightly with the centrifugal force, had watched the landscape rotate around his fixed heading. He took out his phone and tried to record the highway ahead, thinking he'd capture the next turn if it happened. But his phone's camera wouldn't focus properly. The image remained blurry no matter how he adjusted it, as if the highway itself resisted being photographed. Robert returned to his cab and continued driving, now deeply unsettled. The road remained straight for another 20 minutes, giving him time to wonder if he'd imagined the turns or experienced some kind of micro-sleep episode. Then I-10 turned left again, another 90-degree bend that lasted a quarter mile before straightening. His GPS continued showing a straight westward path with no deviations. Over the next hour, the turns became more frequent. Left, right, left, left, right. Each turn was sharp, geometrically precise, lasting exactly the same distance before straightening. The pattern felt deliberate, intentional, as if something was actively manipulating the highway, rather than Robert experiencing hallucinations or equipment errors. At 3:42 a.m., I-10 made a complete circle. Robert felt the turn beginning, the highway curving left more sharply than before. And instead of straightening after a quarter mile, it kept turning. The bend continued, tightening into a full loop that brought Robert back to his starting point. He recognized a distinctive mile marker as he completed the circle, the same marker he'd passed 2 minutes earlier. His odometer showed he'd traveled 1.3 miles. His GPS showed he'd continued straight west for 1.3 miles. But Robert had driven in a complete circle, ending up exactly where he'd started, and the highway ahead looked identical to the highway behind because they were the same stretch of road. Robert tried his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker. This is Vasquez on I-10 westbound between Junction and Fort Stockton. Anyone else out here experiencing weird road conditions?" Static answered him. Not even the usual distant chatter that populated the channel at night. He tried different channels, same result. The CB spectrum was completely empty. The highway turned again. Another circle, this one tighter, maybe half a mile in diameter. Robert completed it in about 90 seconds, finding himself passing the same mile marker for the third time. His GPS insisted he'd traveled another mile west, but his eyes and his truck's actual movement told a different story. He tried stopping, thought maybe if he just parked and waited, the phenomenon would pass, and the road would return to normal. But when he applied his brakes, they didn't respond. The pedal went to the floor with no resistance, no effect. His truck continued at exactly 55 miles per hour, following the curving highway despite his attempts to stop or slow down. The circles got tighter. A quarter-mile diameter. An eighth. Robert's trailer began swaying dangerously as the centrifugal force increased, his load shifting despite the securing chains. He could feel his truck reaching the limits of stability, could sense that another few degrees of tightness in the curves would cause a rollover. Just before that point, the circle stopped. The highway straightened and resumed its westward heading. Robert's brakes suddenly worked again, and he managed to slow down, his heart pounding, his hands cramped from gripping the wheel. He pulled onto the shoulder and sat for several minutes, trying to calm himself. His GPS showed he was near Fort Stockton, exactly where he should be for the time elapsed. But Robert knew he'd been driving in circles for the last hour, covering the same ground repeatedly, making no actual westward progress. The GPS was lying, or reality was lying, or both were true simultaneously in ways that violated everything Robert understood about geography and navigation. He checked his fuel gauge. It showed 3/4 full, which was impossible. He'd been driving for nearly 4 hours at highway speeds with a heavy load. He should have burned through at least half a tank, closer to 2/3. The gauge reading defied basic mathematics of fuel consumption. Robert decided to keep driving. What else could he do? He had a delivery deadline, a load that needed to reach El Paso, and stopping on the shoulder wouldn't change anything. He pulled back onto I-10 and continued west, watching for further anomalies. The highway remained straight for 30 minutes, giving Robert hope that the worst was over. Then something new happened. The road began to spiral upward. Not climb, not follow a mountain grade, but spiral. Like a corkscrew or a helix, the highway curved upward in 3 dimensions, ascending into the air above the Texas landscape. Robert's truck followed the impossible geometry, climbing a road that should have collapsed under its own weight, but somehow remained solid beneath his tires. His headlights illuminated the ascending pavement ahead, showing the highway curving up and away from the ground. Robert looked out his side window and saw the landscape falling away below him, dropping into darkness as his truck climbed higher. He was 50 feet above the ground, then 100, then 200, driving up a spiral highway that existed without supports or foundations. At the apex of the spiral, maybe 300 feet above the desert floor, the highway leveled off and ran straight through empty air. Robert was driving on a road that floated, suspended in nothing, with open space above and below. The surreal nature of it overwhelmed his fear, replaced it with a kind of numb acceptance. This was happening. He was here. The impossible had become temporarily normal. The floating highway section lasted about 2 miles, then spiraled back down, descending in mirror image of the climb. Robert's truck returned to ground level smoothly, and the highway resumed its normal flat westward trajectory, as if the aerial section had never existed. His CB radio suddenly crackled with voices. "Anyone know what's happening to the highway? I just drove through." Static cut off the transmission. Another voice. Turned into a circle, kept going around the same... More static. A third voice. Floating in the air. I'm 300 feet up, and the road is just... Robert grabbed his microphone. "This is Vasquez. I'm experiencing the same thing. The highway is going crazy, turning and spiraling and..." All the voices cut off simultaneously, replaced by a single transmission that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away, filtered through layers of interference. Drivers on I-10 westbound, you are experiencing a temporary dimensional overlap. The highway you are traveling exists in multiple spatial configurations simultaneously. Under normal conditions, your perception is locked to a single configuration. Current atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions have destabilized the perceptual anchoring, allowing you to see and interact with alternate configurations. "What does that mean?" Robert shouted into the microphone. "How do we get back to the normal road?" "You cannot. All configurations are equally normal, equally real. You are driving the same I-10 you have always driven. Your perception of its geometry has simply expanded to include variations that are always present, but usually invisible. Continue west. The overlap will resolve itself within 90 minutes. The transmission ended. Robert's CB went silent again. No voices, no static, just an empty channel. He drove west because the voice had told him to, and because he couldn't think of any alternative. The highway continued its impossible behavior, turning and circling and spiraling, sometimes running straight for miles at ground level, sometimes climbing into the sky, sometimes descending underground into tunnels that shouldn't exist in the flat Texas landscape. At 5:03 a.m., Robert's headlights illuminated something that made his breath catch. Ahead on the highway, visible in the growing pre-dawn light, were other trucks. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all traveling west on I-10, all spread across multiple visible instances of the road. Some trucks drove on the ground-level highway, the one Robert considered normal. Others drove on parallel highways, offset by 100 yards north or south, visible as ghost images following identical paths. Still others drove on elevated highways floating at various heights above the ground. And some drove on highways that intersected at impossible angles, crossing through each other without collision, each existing in its own layer of reality. Robert could see the drivers in some of the trucks, their faces grim and focused, their hands gripping steering wheels. They were experiencing what he was experiencing, trapped in the same dimensional overlap, forced to navigate a highway that had fractured into infinite variations of itself. At 6:31 a.m., exactly 90 minutes after the strange transmission, the variations began to collapse. The floating highways descended and merged with the ground-level road. The parallel highways shifted and aligned, converging into a single path. The impossible intersections resolved themselves as the angles normalized. Within 5 minutes, I-10 appeared normal again, a single straight highway running west across Texas, no curves or spirals or aerial sections. Robert's CB radio exploded with voices as dozens of drivers tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. Everyone had seen the variations, the multiple highways, the impossible geometry. Everyone was confused, shaken, trying to understand. But as they talked, Robert noticed something disturbing. The details of their experiences began to diverge. Some drivers remembered the highway turning in circles. Others remembered it zigzagging. Still others described experiencing vertical loops like a roller coaster. Each driver had a slightly different memory of how the dimensional overlap had manifested, as if each had experienced a personalized version of the phenomenon. Within an hour, the conversations on the CB had changed. Drivers were arguing about what had happened, contradicting each other, insisting their version was correct. Some denied anything unusual had occurred at all, insisted they'd driven straight west with no anomalies. The consensus reality was fracturing, unable to settle on a single narrative of events. By the time Robert reached El Paso at 9:15 a.m., he found that his memories of the night were becoming unreliable. He could remember the highway doing impossible things, but when he tried to recall specific details, they shifted and changed. Had the road turned in circles or spirals? Had it gone underground or into the air? He'd experienced both, he was certain, but the sequence and specifics were already blurring. He delivered his load without incident. The construction site accepted the piping, signed his manifest, reported no delays or complications. From their perspective, Robert had completed a normal, uneventful drive across Texas. His electronic logs showed nothing unusual. His GPS history showed a straight westward path with no deviations. His fuel consumption matched the expected numbers. Robert tried to file a report about the dimensional overlap, tried to document what he'd experienced, but he found himself unable to articulate it clearly. The words wouldn't arrange themselves into coherent descriptions. His memories kept shifting, contradicting themselves, offering different versions of the same events. Within a few days, all he could remember with certainty was that something strange had happened on I-10, something involving the road changing shape. But the specifics had dissolved into vague impressions. Other drivers reported similar memory degradation. The overnight phenomenon became a topic of speculation and rumor in truck stops and online forums, but no one could provide consistent details. Some drivers insisted they'd experienced group hallucinations caused by fatigue or environmental factors. Others believed they'd driven through a localized reality distortion. A few suggested it had all been a shared dream, somehow synchronized across multiple vehicles. Official investigations found nothing anomalous. I-10 had been operating normally throughout the night in question. GPS data from all affected vehicles showed standard westward travel with no deviations. Road conditions were clear. Weather was calm. No atmospheric anomalies recorded. The experiences of dozens of drivers were collectively dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations, a kind of mass hysteria among long-haul truckers. Robert still drives I-10, still makes the Houston to El Paso run regularly. But he approaches the stretch between Junction and Fort Stockton with caution now, watches the highway carefully, stays alert for signs that the road might be fracturing again into its multiple configurations. And sometimes, in his peripheral vision, he sees ghost highways running parallel to the one he's driving on, sees trucks traveling on paths offset from his own, sees the dimensional overlap persisting quietly beneath the surface of normal reality. The highway exists in more than 3 dimensions. Roads that humans built to connect cities and facilitate commerce tap into something deeper, some underlying structure that allows space to fold and geometries to multiply. And under certain conditions, when the electromagnetic fields align and the perceptual anchoring fails, drivers get to see the true nature of the infrastructure they travel daily. Robert suspects that the overlap never really ended, that he and others are still driving through fractured space, but have been locked back into seeing only a single layer of it. He suspects that the highway is always spiraling and turning and splitting into variations, but human perception has been stabilized to filter out everything except the single path that allows commerce and transportation to function. And late at night, when he's alone on I-10 with empty miles ahead and behind, Robert sometimes lets his focus soften, lets his perception drift away from the rigidly maintained single-road narrative. In those moments, he sees the ghosts again, the parallel highways carrying parallel trucks, driven by drivers experiencing slightly different versions of the same journey. And he wonders which version is real, which highway is the true I-10, or if perhaps they all are, existing simultaneously in a landscape that's far stranger and more complex than the maps suggest. Story 7. The Way Station Interview. Catherine Liu had been hauling construction materials across the Southwest for 8 years, maintaining perfect safety records and never receiving a single violation. On April 3, 2021, she pulled into a routine way station outside Flagstaff, Arizona, and discovered that some inspections measure things far more fundamental than weight and paperwork. The way station appeared normal as Catherine approached it at 3:15 p.m. Standard signage directed commercial vehicles to exit the highway and cross the scales. Catherine's rig was well within legal weight limits, her logs were current, and her truck was properly maintained. She expected a quick inspection, maybe 5 minutes, before being waved through to continue her route to Phoenix. She pulled onto the scale platform and waited for the weight reading. Through her windshield, she could see the inspection building, a standard rectangular structure with offices and inspection bays. 2 other trucks were parked in the inspection area, their drivers presumably inside, dealing with paperwork or equipment checks. A uniformed officer emerged from the building and approached Catherine's cab. He was middle-aged, professional in appearance, carrying a tablet computer. Everything looked routine. Catherine rolled down her window and prepared to hand over her documents. "Catherine Liu," the officer said, checking his tablet. "License and registration, please." Catherine provided her documents, noting that the officer had used her name before seeing her ID. Not unusual, the way station systems could pull up driver information from license plate scans. The officer examined her papers briefly, then looked up at her with an expression that didn't quite match his official demeanor. "Ms. Liu, I need you to come inside for a supplementary interview. Please park in Bay 3 and proceed to the second-floor office." "Is there a problem with my load or my logs?" "No problem. This is a routine screening. It won't take long." Something about his tone suggested this was anything but routine. Catherine had been through hundreds of way stations and had never been asked to go to a second-floor office. Most inspections happened in ground-level bays, where officials could easily access vehicles and cargo. Second-floor offices were administrative spaces, not inspection areas. But you didn't refuse official requests at way stations. Catherine parked in the designated bay and walked into the building. The ground floor was empty, which was odd for an operational facility in the middle of the afternoon. She found a stairwell and climbed to the second floor, following signs that directed her to Office 214. The door was open. Inside, a woman sat behind a desk, dressed in a suit rather than a uniform. The room looked more like a corporate interview space than a government inspection office, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting instead of the usual institutional furniture and fluorescent glare. "Catherine Liu," the woman said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming up. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I work with the Highway Administration's Research and Development Division. Please, sit down." Catherine sat, increasingly confused. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. My wait was legal. My paperwork is current. Why am I being interviewed by R&D? Dr. Vasquez smiled, but it was the kind of professional smile that masked rather than conveyed warmth. You're not in any trouble, Ms. Liu. This isn't about violations or regulations. We're conducting a research study on driver perception and navigation skills. The way station serves as a convenient sampling point for recruiting participants. I'm not interested in participating in a research study. I have a delivery deadline. Of course. But I'm afraid participation isn't optional. Your vehicle has been flagged by our monitoring systems as exhibiting certain characteristics that indicate you may have experienced anomalous routing events. We need to ask you some questions about your driving history. Catherine's confusion shifted toward alarm. Anomalous routing events? I don't know what that means. Dr. Vasquez consulted her computer screen. Our systems track vehicle movement patterns across the highway network. Most drivers follow predictable routes, with normal variations for traffic and weather. But some drivers, approximately 0.03%, exhibit routing anomalies that suggest they've encountered non-standard infrastructure. Non-standard infrastructure? Roads that shouldn't exist, routes that don't appear on maps, rest areas in impossible locations, highway configurations that violate known geometry. Based on your GPS data over the past 8 years, you've driven through at least 7 such anomalies. Catherine's mind raced back through 8 years of driving, trying to identify what Dr. Vasquez was referring to. She'd driven thousands of routes, made hundreds of deliveries. Had there been strange roads, unusual rest stops? Nothing specific came to mind, but she also had a vague sense that some trips contained gaps, missing sections where her memory was unclear. I don't remember anything like that, Catherine said. Most people don't. The anomalies include perception suppression fields that cause drivers to forget or rationalize their experiences. But the GPS data doesn't lie. Your truck's transponder has recorded you traveling through spaces that don't officially exist. We need to understand how and why certain drivers encounter these spaces while others don't. Dr. Vasquez turned her screen to show Catherine a map covered with color-coded lines. Catherine recognized it as a representation of her driving history. 8 years of routes plotted across the southwest. But scattered throughout the normal paths were red segments, highlighted sections that didn't follow standard highways. Each red segment represents a period where your GPS coordinates placed you somewhere inconsistent with known road infrastructure, Dr. Vasquez explained. Sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for over an hour. During these periods, you were somewhere else, driving on roads that exist outside the mapped network. Catherine stared at the screen. 7 red segments, just as Dr. Vasquez had said. Catherine couldn't recall any of them specifically, but looking at the dates and locations triggered vague feelings of displacement, moments when she'd felt briefly disoriented or confused about her location. "What are these roads?" Catherine asked. "Where do they go?" "That's what we're trying to understand. The highway system is vastly more complex than public infrastructure maps indicate. There are additional layers, alternate routes, spaces that exist adjacent to or overlapping with standard highways. Most drivers never perceive these spaces. Their navigation systems and their own perception lock them into the mapped network. But some drivers for reasons we haven't fully identified, can perceive and access the alternate spaces. Why? What's the purpose of these alternate roads? Dr. Vasquez leaned back in her chair, her professional demeanor faltering slightly. We don't know. They were discovered accidentally about 15 years ago, when GPS tracking became sophisticated enough to detect the routing anomalies. Since then, we've been trying to map them, understand their structure and function. But it's difficult. The spaces don't remain consistent. Roads that exist one day vanish the next. Rest areas appear and disappear. The geometry itself seems fluid. Catherine felt a chill run through her. Are you saying the highway system is alive? Changing on its own? I'm saying it's not entirely what we think it is. The roads we build tap into something pre-existing, some underlying network that's always been there. When we pour asphalt and paint lane markers, we're not creating new paths, so much as illuminating paths that already exist in some form. And occasionally, drivers stumble off the illuminated paths into the darker network beyond. What happens to drivers who go too far into the alternate spaces? Some come back with no memory of the experience, like you. Some come back changed, reporting impossible experiences that fade quickly from memory. And some don't come back at all. We've documented 43 permanent disappearances over the last 15 years. Drivers who entered the alternate network and never returned to the mapped roads. Catherine's hands gripped the arms of her chair. Why are you telling me this? Why bring me here? Because you've been in and out of the alternate network 7 times and returned safely each time. That makes you valuable for research. We want to understand what characteristics allow certain drivers to navigate the alternate spaces successfully. And we want to recruit you for a controlled experiment. Absolutely not. I'm not interested in deliberately going into dangerous spaces. Dr. Vasquez nodded, as if she'd expected this response. I understand your reluctance, but consider, you've already been there 7 times without conscious awareness. The alternate network has been pulling you in periodically throughout your career. Wouldn't you prefer to understand why? Wouldn't you want some control over when and how it happens? Catherine stood up. No. I want to complete my delivery and continue my job without being part of whatever this is. Am I free to leave? Of course. Participation is voluntary. But Ms. Liu, please understand. Now that you're aware of the alternate network, now that your conscious mind has acknowledged its existence, you're more likely to perceive it clearly. The suppression fields that kept your memories vague won't work as effectively anymore. You'll start noticing the anomalies, recognizing when you're drifting off the mapped roads. That awareness can be dangerous without proper understanding. Then give me understanding. Tell me how to avoid the alternate network. Dr. Vasquez shook her head. We don't know how to avoid it reliably. The selection mechanism isn't fully understood. It may be random. It may be based on psychological characteristics. Some researchers think the network itself chooses which drivers to pull in, though that implies a level of intentionality we can't confirm. So you're saying I'm stuck? That I'll keep slipping into these alternate spaces with no control? Potentially, yes. Unless you agree to work with us. We can provide monitoring equipment, support resources, communication protocols. If you enter the alternate network during one of our controlled experiments, we'll be tracking you, ready to provide assistance if something goes wrong. It's safer than experiencing it alone and unprepared. Catherine walked to the office window and looked out at the way station below. Her truck sat in Bay 3, looking perfectly normal and ordinary. Other trucks were pulling onto the scales, going through standard inspections, continuing their routes without being told about alternate highway networks and spaces outside reality. She envied them their ignorance. "How long do I have to decide?" Catherine asked. "There's no deadline, but I strongly recommend you make a decision soon. Your next encounter with the alternate network could happen at any time, possibly within days or even hours. The frequency varies unpredictably. Going in without preparation or support is a significant risk." Catherine turned back to face Dr. Vasquez. "If I agree, what exactly would I be doing?" "Initially, just driving your normal routes with enhanced monitoring equipment installed in your truck. The equipment tracks not just your GPS coordinates, but also a range of environmental and perceptual indicators that correlate with alternate network access. When the indicators suggest you're approaching an entry point, you'll receive an alert. At that point, you can choose to enter consciously rather than drifting in unaware. And if I enter consciously, you document everything. Take photos, record video, describe what you see and experience. Maintain radio contact with our monitoring team. Navigate as carefully as possible and look for markers or signs that might help us understand the network structure. Then exit back to the mapped roads when safely possible." "And if I can't exit?" Dr. Vasquez's expression became somber. "Then we'd do everything possible to guide you out remotely. But I won't lie to you, Ms. Liu. There's a risk. Some drivers who've worked with us have had difficulty returning. The alternate network can be disorienting, and some spaces seem designed to trap travelers. But the risk exists whether you work with us or not. At least with our support, you'd have resources and assistance." Catherine sat back down, feeling the weight of the decision, continue driving in ignorance, hoping the alternate network wouldn't pull her in, or acknowledge the phenomenon and try to understand it, accepting the risks that came with awareness. "I need time to think," Catherine said finally. "Of course. Take my card. Call whenever you're ready to discuss further." Dr. Vasquez handed over a business card with contact information. "In the meantime, Ms. Liu, pay attention to your routes. Notice when things feel slightly off, when distances don't seem right, when the landscape looks subtly wrong. Those are the early signs that you're drifting into alternate space. If you recognize them, you might be able to navigate back before going too deep." Catherine left the office, descended to the ground floor, and returned to her truck. The way station officer who'd initially pulled her over was nowhere to be seen. The building felt empty, lifeless, as if the interview had taken place in a space separate from the normal operations of the facility. She completed her delivery to Phoenix without incident. But Catherine found herself hyper-aware of the highway now, watching for signs of the alternate network Dr. Vasquez had described. Every slight curve felt suspicious. Every rest area looked potentially wrong. Distances between mile markers seemed inconsistent, though she couldn't verify if they actually were, or if her paranoia was making her imagine discrepancies. 2 weeks later, Catherine was driving a route through New Mexico when her GPS started showing impossible coordinates. The navigation system insisted she was 50 miles north of where she'd been 30 seconds earlier, despite driving in a straight line at constant speed. The landscape outside her windows looked normal, but distances felt wrong. as if space itself had compressed or expanded. Catherine pulled over and looked at Dr. Vasquez's business card, still tucked into her sun visor. She could call, report what was happening, accept the monitoring equipment, and become part of the research program. Or she could ignore it, write it off as a GPS glitch, continue driving and hope the anomaly resolved itself. She chose the latter. Catherine reset her GPS, waited for it to reacquire satellites, and continued driving when the coordinates stabilized. The rest of the trip proceeded normally, and she tried to convince herself nothing unusual had happened. But over the following months, the incidents became more frequent. GPS anomalies, distance inconsistencies, moments when the highway ahead looked subtly wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Catherine started documenting them in a private log, noting dates and locations, trying to identify patterns. The red segments on her personal map were multiplying. She was entering the alternate network more frequently, staying longer, drifting deeper into spaces that didn't appear in any official infrastructure database. And Catherine was beginning to see things during these incidents. Structures beside the highway that vanished when she looked directly at them. Vehicles that moved with impossible physics. Signs written in symbols she couldn't read, but somehow understood. 6 months after the way station interview, Catherine finally called Dr. Vasquez. She'd reached the point where the alternate network was becoming more real to her than the mapped roads, where she spent more time navigating impossible spaces than following standard routes. She needed help, needed understanding, needed to know what she was becoming. Dr. Vasquez sounded unsurprised to hear from her. "You've been holding out longer than most, Miss Liu. I've been watching your GPS data. You're deep in the network now, deeper than almost anyone we've tracked. How much longer do you think you can navigate it alone?" "I can't," Catherine admitted. "I need your equipment, your support. But Dr. Vasquez, I need to know, what happens to people like me eventually? Do we ever get back to seeing normal roads, or does the alternate network become permanent?" There was a long pause before Dr. Vasquez answered. "Honestly, we don't know. Some drivers seem to stabilize, to learn how to navigate between mapped and unmapped spaces while maintaining their connection to baseline reality. Others drift progressively deeper until they lose touch with the normal highway system entirely. They're not missing in the traditional sense, but they've become untethered from the infrastructure the rest of us use." "Are you saying I might become one of the permanently missing?" "I'm saying you're at a critical juncture, Ms. Liu. The decisions you make in the next few weeks will determine whether you learn to control your navigation abilities or lose yourself completely in spaces humans weren't meant to access. That's why I'm glad you called. We can help you stabilize, teach you techniques other successful navigators have developed. But you have to trust us and commit fully to the process." Catherine looked out at the highway ahead, no longer certain if she was seeing the mapped I-40 or some alternate version of it. The road looked real enough, but so did all the impossible things she'd been seeing lately. Trust and certainty had become luxuries she could no longer afford. "When can we start?" Catherine asked. "Immediately. I'm sending you coordinates for our training facility. Can you reach southern Colorado in the next 2 days?" "Yes." "Good. Drive there directly. Don't make any stops you don't absolutely need. The alternate network seems to know when drivers are seeking help. and it sometimes makes extraction difficult. Stay focused on the coordinates I'm sending. Trust your GPS even when the landscape looks wrong, and don't interact with anything unusual you see along the way." Catherine agreed and ended the call. She received the coordinates moments later and programmed them into her navigation system. The route would take her through areas she'd driven dozens of times, familiar highways that should pose no challenges. But as Catherine pulled back onto the road, she had the distinct impression that something was watching her from spaces between the mile markers, from the gaps in the infrastructure, from the alternate network that had claimed her as one of its wayward travelers. And she wasn't certain whether the training facility in Colorado would teach her to escape that attention or simply formalize her permanent residence in the spaces most drivers never see. The highway stretched ahead, simultaneously familiar and utterly alien, offering no guarantees about where it might actually lead.